Fun to describe.
Where should I be sitting? Next to you?
We need a scribe. Who would like to volunteer to take notes? Anyone that we You can simply log, how about a couple people who want to sit on either pad? Okay, thank you, Eric. Anyone else want to sit on either pad and help them? That would be good. So I should have gone with you.
I figured out what the red button is for.
It's for if you need to have.
No. You have it completely wrong. It's the AD eject button.
Oh, is that it?
If you want to eject the AD from your reading, you press the red button and they go right through the roof and out the gone. I like that much better, don't you, Sue?
I think that would just be really exciting. On that note, I'm glad you joined us. Okay. Oh. Well.
You are being recorded.
Yeah, I noticed that, huh?
And you think that's going to stop me?
If you think that, you really have picked the wrong person. Okay. If you're here, please sign the blue sheets. Otherwise, we end up in an even smaller, farther away room.
What should we do if we're not predicting?
So, please come in, find a seat. Don't worry if I've been talking
We're both
about
tired.
the agenda. Yeah. Oh, I know what I needed to do next. Yes. The famous drive. Nope, that wasn't the way it is.
What do you need?
I just need to find where this plugs in.
What is it?
That's
Oh, let
the
me see.
thing.
Let me see. There's a thing on it someplace.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. Oh, I bet it's with the, this is not a drive.
Oh, there you go.
There we go.
They put that on there just for you, sir.
Yeah, because they know I have problems finding it. Yeah, I guess that. You know, who knew that it would fit so tightly next to the other one? Okay. Let's hope it's working. Oh, that's great. Okay. And this is projecting someplace? It was, it is.
Wait, that one's off.
That one's off. There we go. And the red button is this one.
There we go.
Welcome, welcome. Hi, Peter. You really think you're in the right place?
Yeah.
No, that's good. We'll see. You really want to know that, huh? Okay. The lights are there, but no one's home yet. Okay. Well, the slides are online in case the projector doesn't really start up. Okay, this was administrivia. Fortunately, I always know that something happens to you. We just had the administrivia moment. Okay, there are the note wells. Please read the note well. It says, how many people are here for the first time? All right. Well, welcome. Thank you. Thank you for coming and joining us, in which case I will truly do a note well dance. The note well is about what happens when you contribute. It's done so that we can exist in a fairly good IPR situation. Oh, sorry, please. Thank you. I will use the microphone. Thank you for our AFB person who wonders. By the way, if you are presenting or if you're speaking, you probably should do better than I. Use a microphone or use the other one. They are recording it. The benefit of that for you who are new and for you who've been here before is that the recording, if you want to work online later, is actually you can hear. So you stand next to the mic or if you're talking and asking questions. So I'm going to go back for the new people on the note well, and for those of you who have been here a while, remember that any submission intended by the contributor as part of the RFC or any statement and the next set of details below tell you what a statement is under the IPR rules for the IETF. That says if you participate, understand what the IPR rules are. If you have questions, ask me afterwards. But essentially, all the things you say are part of the IETF process. Okay. So let's go through the agenda. The first thing is we'll go through the agenda, and what we do is we bash the agenda, and what that means is we make corrections. So if you're new, please ask questions about the agenda. It's a pretty free form, especially with Russ and I. You can interrupt us anytime. Then I have the chair slides that talk about what progress the working groups made. We have results from a hackathon. For those who are new, a hackathon happened on Saturday and Sunday, in which a bunch of people came back to the IETF viewpoint of having running code and rough consensus. We tried to get some running code, and I'll talk about what we did with I2RS on that. Then I'll give a brief tutorial, which I hope if you're new, you'll take a look at, ask questions about how I2RS actually works. I'll give you an example for those people who come from the systems viewpoint, in which case we'll pretend we have a wall thermometer and we'll try to work on setting it via this information system. And then I will go through some examples of how it works for routes. And then after that brief tutorial, we will walk through updates on the RIB models. This is a lightning moment where we're trying to tell you what progress we've had by reviews, by comments, by code, and how that can help us have better data models. Then we're going to have a fairly lengthy discussion on the last of our requirements, which is the the requirements for the ephemeral data store. Hi, Mark, you can sit up in front and we'll like it. Then we're going to have some new work on the DC fabric, and we're going to have a conflict resolution discussion from Pedro, and those are two topics we brought up. Anyone want to bash the agenda? That doesn't mean you want to bash the working group chairs. You'll have to do that after the session. Okay. There's some more seats toward the back as well. Thank you, Bichette. Okay. So, any changes? Okay, we go to the next one.
You're next, right, sir?
Yeah, I have several of these. Okay. And that was, they're numbered. I don't have two of them. Can you see the number? Yeah. Okay, thank you. We're, please don't hesitate, move over, and if you've got an empty seat, wave for people because that'll help them sit. Okay, the chair slides. The good news is thanks to hard work by all the authors, we have 4 RFCs through the ISG and published. This is a tremendous progress. The problem statement architecture has been worked on a long time, but I especially want to thank the traceability team and the pub sub team. I think that's really changing not only RTS work, but all stuff inside of NetComp and RESTComp. So thanks to Joe, Gonzalo Carlos, and Eric, Alex, and Gonzalez. We've got one at the ISG, which is the protocol security requirements, and we've got the ephemeral state to essentially wrap up the protocol requirements. We also have the security environment requirements, which will be ready for last call. The authors want to take a few runs at it, and I'd like Russ, who's a new chair. Jeff, are you here? I was waiting for this till, is Jeff Haas here in the background? Yep. We want to thank Jeff for being the chair of I2RS for a long time personally, but a round of thanks. Yes, and we want to thank Russ for joining as chair. Yay.
Hey, Jeff, we still have a seat up here if you want it.
Okay. We have data models, which we're asking if we're ready for last call. I'm really suggesting, Russ is suggesting we actually think about implementations from what's happening with those data models. And we want to go through a directorates check, which will probably have the 3 directorates check, which is I2RS and, routing, security, and maybe the Yang doctors. Okay. After that, we have to look at chartering, rechartering topics, and I went through the chartering look online as part of the transition between Jeff and Russ, and I found that we had some note that said we had language encoding requirements and comparisons of protocols against requirements. I have to talk to my AD, but I'm not sure how that's necessary. And we have a question of whether we should revise our use case and publish it. Anyway, we'll talk to the AD, and we may have new work, and so some of the things that are being presented to are not specifically in charter, but we're going to talk about it, which is the service topology and conflict requirements. Okay, now that's the end of that one. Any questions on our status? Okay, I'm only 5 minutes behind. Say number 3. Okay. Number 3.
It's the hackathon.
Oh, that's the hackathon, yeah.
That's the right one, right?
Yep, that's what you want. Just hit it and
Where'd it go? Where'd it go? There it is.
there it goes. Okay, so this is actually, I hope, interesting in that we got to code. Ed, will you raise your hand? And Don and anyone else? Yes, there's Mamu. Okay, all of these guys, and did we see Thomas here? No, okay. Edwin, they all help work on the code for the I2RS project in the hackathon. We're working to try to get an RSD daemon in Zebra. We did some early work in attaching it to CompD, which is Cisco's DevNet, essentially agent for, or network server in the NetConf world. We would call it essentially an agent in the I2RS world, and getting it to talk to various clients, either a Yang Pro and a NetConf client. We didn't do the Yang Pro this time, did we, Don? No, just the previous time. So the good news is we're making progress. The bad news is two things sort of slowed us down. It takes a lot of time to work out the infrastructure, like the build process for Quagga was one of our blocks. The other thing was some of the simple things that you would do inside of, I think I have it here. Their build process inside of the CompD took a high-level Yang statement at the top, and we couldn't quite figure out exactly. But we're going to write up notes on that, and we learned a couple things about the model, and that's the thing I want to sort of share here from that team, is one thing about our model is the basic next hops we want to consider that it's a little complex. When I actually wrote through the code on that hop base, which has a whole bunch of choices of MPLS, IPv4, we may want to look at it and say, should we make it a little simpler, maybe just an IP1 and have a next hop basic extended? So I'll kick off a comment on the list on the next hop rib table. The other thing that became obvious once you started coding is we've made our rib extremely flexible with a lot of choices. That will create 3 to 5 levels of meta tags. That wasn't a real problem from the code, but that's something for implementers to know. I think that's it. There's the team. Don Fedek, Thomas Schaefer, Edwin, Mamu, myself. Okay, small team working good. Next one. There's a lot of this status stuff, but since what we found last time is when I skipped all of it, I lost people who are brand new. There's a 4, yep. Okay, so this is now all the tutorial information. Just as a tutorial for those people, how many people have never seen details on how the I2RS is supposed to work? Okay, new, good. Other people, maybe this will help you focus the attention. There are actually I2RS protocol is a reuse protocol. Who knows what a US reuse protocol is supposed to be in IETF? Well, I didn't for a long time, so I'll admit to that. Reuse protocol is you're actually reusing another protocol from a group, this time NetConf and RESTConf, and you may request some new features, call home, Yang library, Yang patch, Yang push, and we're defining something new, which is the ephemeral data store. So that's why we talk about NetConf a lot and the rest. Okay, oops, I did something, yep. Okay, so I2RS is a data-driven protocol. The data drives the function, okay? And so the Yang decides the data model. So it's going to look like we're really focused on data models all the time, and the answer is it's true. And the data model, rather than eventually the CLI configuring it, becomes the management paradigm. Okay, why did you do that? Well, we're going from a world of where the CLI was the thing that guided everything to NetConf Yang data models, where we're having to consider for I2RS 2 new features. What's the operational state? And what's an ephemeral data model? Now, NetMod, NetConf, and a lot of buzz this week will be about ephemeral state. Is Kent here? Okay, right. Ephemeral state is, and op state is some of the buzz. So if you're interested, please join into the NetConf, NetMod discussion. I know that's in the ops area, but we're reusing the ops protocol to manage the routing. Okay, so again, initially you're probably familiar with the idea of a CLI where you have a candidate running in a startup and you have stuff that is operational state that you aren't actually configuring like that. You have a data model, and I'll leave this because you'll probably see more of it in NetConf, but a simple way to look at it was we had some, in the past, intended configuration, some applied, and some derived state. And now you're making ephemeral additions to configuration and to perhaps operational state. Now, part of the discussion this week that you would be having in NetConf and NetMod is exactly how that works with validation. Okay, because it's not really sure how it works versus the configuration, because ephemeral state is different. We're adding it, we're reusing the protocol and adding the code. So again, that's why we tried that implementation. So when we have an agent, we can see what happens. Right now, what we really did is went to the router daemon and we're stuffing in route state. We were adding route. When we first chartered I2RS, that's our idea. I2RS was to provide a really substantial ability to get to two different types of RIB. One was the regular RIB where you add routes to the protocol, and the other one was a place to add filters to the filter table. Very simple change to having programmatic routers that can route and to filter. A good idea that happened to us along the way is the topology idea, where we're actually saving topology information and perhaps maybe changing the topology information that will affect how things work. Normally today, operational state comes from the OSPF topology or the ISIS protocol, and it saves topology information. Okay, so now I'm going to give you three simple additions that are going to tell you what how it actually works. And there's little diagrams. And if you're new, this is a time where you stand up to the mic and say, I haven't got a clue what you're saying, and we try to explain it. Because otherwise, the rest of the things we're going to discuss, which are advanced topics, may not be understandable. And this is the time we want people to begin to understand the model so that when we ship out, announce out Quagga code, by the way, I forgot one thing in the hackathon. One benefit to our work is that Edwin here has, for his research work, started from a bottoms up, meaning he started from the router base and tried to implement up the data model. And from my attempt to go down, I started from the top down, which is I started next to the configuration daemon, which is the conf date. Just a minute, I think there's a red light. No red light. Okay. On, off. Okay. I started next to the conf daemon and coded downward. Okay. So that gave us two different viewpoints on how the data models were implemented, and we found some fun things there. And I'll highlight some of the things that Edwin has sent to the list. John Scudder also reviewed stuff from a purely operational viewpoint. So my point is, pay attention to these data models, the implementation, and how we explain the simple ones. It may help you as we describe the RIB model. Okay, first of all, the thermometer. Let's assume that we're in a room like this and it's getting hot. And we first have a state that you set the thermometer, and then we have what's actually happening. Maybe we push it to get it cooler, and it's taking a while to get there. So ephemeral state might be, for short time, I want to have a temporary thing. We're in a meeting like this where I can pop the state. Afterwards, I want it to go to its normal settings. Sometimes I want that with my kids because they'll pop up and down the temperature, and I'd like to have it go back. So eventually what you have is you have a desired temperature. you have a running temperature, and you have a startup. And eventually you apply the intended temperature and get a config, and you get your actual temperature to go up a little. Okay, but if you have ephemeral true, let's see what it look like. You have a candidate, you have a running, you have a desired temperature, you get to your applied config temperature, and you change. But now we have that for a moment where we'll let it go a little warmer. Let's say it's the winter time, and you set it as the ephemeral. That eventually goes into the applied config, and it goes up. Okay, so that's a very simple thing. You set it, eventually the temperature. Now, what does that actually look like in the actual messages that pass back and forth? We're going to go with a RESTconf example, and then later with a netconf example. Your first thing is you have a RESTconf example, and the first thing you're going to do is for that ephemeral, for the regular edit, you would just push a desired temperature, and if you do the ephemeral, all you would do is set the context to ephemeral. So the top you see a put/RESTconf/data/thermostat for the desired temperature. On the bottom you say that the context in the data is really ephemeral. Okay, so what does that look like? On one end, you get an HTTP message with a put message to an example host, and you get the desired temperature. On the other hand, you get an HTTP message with an OK that says it's OK. Now that is a simple write. This is the most simple piece of how this can all work. So there you see a put, you see the HTTP coming back with the ephemeral state. Okay, how does it look like inside of netconf? You have a target of running, you see the desired temperature. You go through the message for the RPC, you get an edit config, you target the running, you have a change in the configuration. Again, what you see is you get an RPC that is changing it, and you get an RPC reply back that says, yep, you're okay. Now these are the simple write. When you start doing the RPCs, it's a different set of formats, but the concept is there, right? So there's your ephemeral data store, which is one way it could be encoded. We have not confirmed with the netmod group how they want to do the ephemeral. So this is just warning, an example of how it might be done. If you're interested in some of these comments, they're both in the slides and in the protocol strawman. Because we're giving the netmod group as a reuse protocol, we're giving them examples. By the way, I think there's a couple more seats, but if you want, there's one or two there. If it's too warm, though, you're welcome to get up and go anytime. Again, here's your RPC in and your RPC required. A very, very simple mechanism. Okay, so now I'm going to give you the same example, but instead of watching that little cryptic stuff, you can go back and forth. I'm going to show you the example of a route add simply by going through the basic building blocks, because in the back, it's probably easier to see. I encourage you, if you want the details on the first one, pull down the slides and walk through it. Don't hesitate to ask myself, Russ, or any of the folks you saw on the hackathon list how it actually works. Hi, Pedro. Don't worry, I'm sure there's a few chairs over here. Since you're going to speak, I hope you'll stay around. So let's go through how the route add works. Okay, you have a candidate route. You have a 128.2.16 with a next hop of 192.11.1.1. You get a running to the same thing. You eventually save it to startup. It eventually goes down to an intended config, which goes to be applied. Instead of having a next hop of 192.1.11 installed, which you did earlier, you install the state of 1. You then have the ephemeral, which it goes to applied config and then goes to an install state. Now you've just overwritten just the next top there, but that changes the route. We have an amazingly well thought out set of extended next tops in the rib model, but that's an advanced topic. If you read it and you have questions, again, ask the list, ask the chairs. This is a time that there is no question that we're not happy to answer, other than why are we doing this? We're having fun is the answer. So the RIB state has both base state, it has operational state, and it has extensions. So as you read the RIB model, do be aware you have the basic configuration. Hi, I have an instance, which is a VRF. I have a RIB, which is based on AFI-SAFI, and I have a route, which is identified by a ID, and I have a next hop, which is identified by an ID. So if you load enough of the next hop, you can simply say, this is the route number 10 with this prefix. Please give me next hops 1 and 2 as ECMP. So it's actually fairly easy. Again, if you're doing the same thing with the last thing, which is we had two ribs. There's a route rib to add and a filter rib, which is how am I going to filter traffic? That second filter rib would have some of these examples. Hi, I have filter 1. I have IP destination 192.5.5.1. My action is if you see this, I'm being spammed, drop it. Okay, I'm being spammed is not in the rib, but drop is. And you put it to a running configuration. And by the way, if you have a Linux system and you have IP tables, you can type the same sort of thing in off of IP tables. Or if you have something that goes to the net filter inside of a Linux box or something like that in another box, it's there. If you go to the startup, you can say the same thing. If you were in the regular IP tables, you would put it to an intended config, which eventually NetFilter would drop into the configuration, and you would have a derived state. The derived state might have operational state. By the way, 5 packets came in that hit this, and we dropped them, and that would be the operational state. Again, if you're an I2RS client, perhaps you want to, instead of dropping it, forward it to a IPS machine. You might be wanting to forward it to some post-processing. So that goes to the intended filter. You have an applied filter that now sends that traffic to 192.11.1.12, and you put it in the derived state, and it now has 11 matches because we've begun to be spammed by that. Okay? Questions on the tutorial? If you get thinking and you want to ask questions afterwards, I'm glad to hang out. The implementers are glad to hang out and talk about how it actually is coded. Okay, again, this is our structure. There is GitHub. There's a GitHub location for our I2RS working group. The hackathon, that code is really a whole bunch of pieces we put together and we're using to up and download things for the hackathon. We will start to put implementation codes up under code implementation. We hope that that'll be ready to try, and we're looking for people. Once we start to put it, we'll announce it to the list, pull down the code, run it on your Linux machine, and try it out. Okay? One comment, the CompD design requires a Cisco dev license. That's not a listen, but a license, excuse me. That was early morning sleepiness. We will probably put up deltas to that license and provide you a way to get to it for the netconfd. We did not have an open source netconf resconf daemon. I don't know of an open source one. Do you, Andy? Okay, so there's some really good, we've had a really good support by the people writing daemons from HumaWorks and from Cisco folks, which is the old TailF group or the TailF group inside of Cisco. Okay, why don't we go to the next slide? We're on 5. Now's when you get to have fun. I do the introduction on the ephemeral state. Okay, this is the ephemeral state. This is now, we're going from introduction to we're going to go and talk about the last of our significant requirements, which is ephemeral state. I'm going to give you the description of ephemeral state, and because I'm an author, Russ is going to get to monitor the discussion as the chair. Jeff and I are authors on this because we started to collect this data from the working group, and it's been a wonderful adventure. I started this being very naive and wondering about ephemeral state, and I keep walking through this ephemeral state one more time. I put up this jukebox because I feel like the discussion is like the jukebox is named One More Time. It's named One More Time, and my husband wants one of them, though it's about $2,000 US, because it used to be in the 50s full of 45s, and now it's full of CDs. I was trying to remember that. I even have 45s in the house. My husband has a interesting hobby and does all sorts of jukebox restoration, so that's what he wants. So being naive about ephemeral is the fact we've talked about it for 4 years, and so we understand it. But one thing that's been very helpful in our discussions with NetMod and NetConf is I'm not sure we really did. So being creative people, I think we need to be at home with all sorts of things. So if you're working again, the NetMod and NetConf discussion times are there, and I'm going to go through the requirements. But before we go through the requirements, I'm going to talk about why I was so naive. I showed you in the earlier picture a simple model that it's not draft Wilton on that one. I missed that. That's what we got from Ken Watson, and excuse me to Ken, I'll upload a new slide, where we basically had running ephemeral, intended config, applied config, and derived state. But as we've gone forward in these discussions, there have been 3 or 4 other models. The first one is draft Wilton, where he begins to discuss what's configuration, which is CT, what's writable, what's readable, which is RO. So in that one, he says there's running and startup and persistent configuration, and ephemeral comes someplace in there, and then intended config and applied, and then system state. And that the ephemeral config at the bottom is really where you can read and write. Well, that got us to another model, which is a little bit clearer from Ken. There's which says you have config, ephemeral, and local intended state. And then you have applied configuration, which is really the copy inside of the system or the router, where you have config and ephemeral, and it's read-only but config true. And then you have derived state, which has both config and ephemeral. Okay, that's one way to look at it, but one thing it doesn't really bring out is what are the sequences of state and what's the validation and what happens. So Jürgen, in his careful and thoughtful work, went through the states, and some of this is coming from a lengthy discussion you saw the beginning of on the I2RS list and the end with the chairs. So the candidate in Jürgen's model looks about the same and goes to running, and at the session between the running and the intended, you get rid of the inactive, and inside of the intended you validate it. When you get it to applied, which is when you go at that B interface, you go to read, and when you get to system state, you use auto discover. Perhaps you want to auto discover the LSP connection. Okay, but Russ and I looked at it and we said not quite. We would put ephemeral config into running config, where you also remove the inactive. You have something subject to validation so that you validate things for the intended. At the session B, you put the missing resources are delayed and get rid of the fact you might not have an interface. You can't really have a static route that you don't know where it goes out. the data, and then you would have applied configuration. But you may have injected ephemeral state that would go into operational state. And what you're really trying to affect in all routers is forwarding. Because in the end, we're not managing just to manage something fun. We're doing that. Now, the far one is in the I2RS, here's I2RS protocol state. But that's just a set of notes I've been keeping. And it comes from really Russ's picture in discussions with Jürgen. Okay, here I'll come back to, but this is my opinion, worthy of debate, on what are the pros and cons on each of these features for ephemeral state. They're just pros and cons. These might be useful. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the requirements and come back to this pros and cons if you're interested, but first you sort of have to look at the requirements. But I wanted to let you know that we're looking at, does that checking work? Does it work with, and the checking in Yang 1.1 is defined as either message checking or things which really look at how you save state at netconf or restconf. We need to look as what happens to operational state. Does ephemeral nationally augment Yang models? One thing you find about Yang models is you really don't want to write Yang model after Yang model after Yang model. You'd like to save the stuff that's the same and not repeat it. So you just want to augment, and that's a really nice thing. Then can you use the lovely event notify thing that PubSub is doing? Can you query ephemeral and local separately and together so that we know what the overlay is? Can you tailor the validation, and does ephemeral act like other control plane traffic in order to handle forwarding? Then there are cons, which is you can't, I2RS was designed in the architecture to be able to speed up things. Can you do that? Does ephemeral need to create its own validation? And can you see if there's a failure to not be able to see ephemeral and local configuration separately? So these are all my opinion. I may be wrong on it, but it's a start to the discussion. Okay, we need feedback on that, but the first thing we need to finalize on is our 15 requirements for ephemeral state and 3 from PubSub. Let's look at it. Now, this is one more time. We're going to explain it, ask questions. How do you want to handle this? Do you want to take the hum at the end?
Yeah, we can take a hum at the end. I'll just say this is probably the one point where the working group is really got to make a decision and do something, because this is really crucial to whether or not I2RS is usable in a lot of the use cases people are imagining and thinking about. So we really kind of need to think about this and get it right.
And we really need to close it off.
Yeah, we need to close it off. It needs to be
How
decided.
many, I think this is the 4th or 5th time we've come back, and I'm just ready to say, I think we've got it. I think we've heard it. But, you know, if we've made a mistake, we also want to hear that. Okay, so I'm going to go through it, and please come to the mic, ask questions, discuss it. We've had a lot of discussion on the list. We've tried to adapt the wording. I think in most cases, we haven't changed anything major at all. We're just playing with some of the words to try to be clear. And that's important because we're transferring these requirements over to netconf and into netmod. So clarity is crucial. Okay, so ephemeral number 1. This is how ephemeral persists. And the bottom line is it doesn't persist against a reboot. Now, I encourage you to read this. I assume with this large model, do you think I should read it exactly?
No.
Okay.
No,
Okay.
fine.
So
Oh, somebody's going to the mic.
now we have our first comment. Thank you, Andy.
Hi, Andy Bierman. In your slide, you showed ephemeral feeding into the running data store. Running data store persists. You seem to think it's an important attribute of I2RS that if the box accidentally reboots, that it doesn't bring back anything from I2RS.
That's
Most
correct.
of the time when the box reboots, it's either a rare maintenance event or it's unscheduled crash. Okay, those are the 2 ways you reboot a router. right? So the fact that the box is rebooting, to me, seems irrelevant. But to you guys, it's important, fine. But that means that it can't be part of the running config, because running config is NV stored by definition.
Yes,
So,
there has to be some.
so
changes.
there are two aspects I would like to see solved, and I don't really care about requirements drafts because they're just written to reverse engineer a solution in the form of requirements. Okay, and I don't care about that. But I really think the people with the solution that think they match this, write it up, because people who don't, pay attention to the requirements get told you don't meet the requirements, go away. And so we'll go away. But there's two aspects of this I'd really like to understand. One is which wins. Does ephemeral override running, or does running override ephemeral? And the answer can't be, it's up to you. It has to be part of the standard. So I don't really see a use case or even understand why you would have the ephemeral config if its purpose wasn't to override running.
The purpose architecturally is to override the local configuration, and that's in the architecture document.
Okay.
And
so that means that you'd never have a case where you're configuring I2RS to override local config, right?
it
So we
it
can
is the
decide that.
case that it is by default overriding local config. However, in our discussions with operations and how to deploy this, there is a switch there so that you might want to start up one of these boxes and say, for right now, don't override local config till I feel comfortable that this is working, and that's the purpose behind it.
So Andy, let
I
me
don't
ask you
understand
something.
that at all.
Hang on a second, Andy. Let me ask something, because I'm just trying to make sure I understand. Let's say I go into a router, I configure something, a loopback interface. I don't write the config. It takes effect, but I don't actually write the config. And I reboot the router, it comes back up without that loopback interface because I never wrote the config. What would you call that?
A Cisco box.
Well, okay.
Yeah, so you're talking about an implementation detail of write mem. That
Okay.
you have to make an explicit. That's what the startup config in netconf is for, is to handle iOS. That's the only reason it's there. So
Okay.
so you can, so that's saved to storage. But that, I don't understand why do I need a separate data store if I'm not going to it's not, purpose isn't to override it. Otherwise,
The
just throw it
purpose
all into
is-
the same data store.
It is to override it. If there was words that said it isn't to override it, I think we've said repeatedly, it's to override it. But right here, we're talking about persistence. We'll go to overriding in the next
Okay.
requirements.
Jeff, you have go ahead. Clarification.
Oh, excuse me,
Overlay,
Jeff has
yes.
used the word overlay.
Yes, overlay.
Okay. All right. So the persistence model is that the controller handles that,
Yes.
not the router. That's
Yes.
fine.
Yes.
And you can. It looks awful like a configuration server. So a box can boot and go get its config from a config server. That's whether or not that was saved or learned just now or made up on the fly really doesn't matter to the box getting the config. But that's implementation detail. But you think it's part of the architecture. But that's okay. But I think it's real important that the overlay be consistent. It isn't. Sometimes I want the overlay and other times I don't, because if whatever's in the ephemeral data store is going to take precedence and is going to be used, it overlays on top of the.
Yes.
So.
Yes. The other switches are there were just for having a sane deployment where you might want to have the code in and the feature turned off.
So Sue and Andy, I think this is where we get into trouble with the RIB versus the quote unquote configuration.
That's correct.
Right, because the RIB doesn't always overlay. Sometimes it loses against the local routing process.
Yes.
And that's why I think it's crucial to make that distinction absolutely clear.
Okay.
Sorry.
Is it?
I'm not saying it's not here. I'm saying that.
No, I just meant if this is unclear in this requirement, we'll have others. Go ahead, Eric.
I guess the question, but more of a statement, is on the On the replay actions from the client and agent, I definitely think that you have to have everything persist, not persist across reboots. The question is who is allowed to write against it. Obviously, many people can write against the data store, ephemeral or not. Is there an assumption in this requirement that the replay or the restore has to be done after a reboot, or is there any type of statement about when that replay action would come to restore state?
Yes, but that will come in the multi-headed control if you're talking about the second, and that's requirements 11 through 15. And if I could deal with that text
Okay.
as it is, that would be the best place.
All right.
Eric. No, your turn. Your turn. Yes.
George Hall.
Yeah.
Cisco. So in MPLS and I think there's a few other protocols, we have some things that try to regain state. That is, my state gets blown away, but the line cards are still up, and then the brain comes back alive, and it asks the line cards what's going on with these various label settings, and rebuilds state. I'm just wondering how that fits into this whole thing, because maybe this is why they want the switch, because this is going to get rebuilt. It's running properly down here, but it has to get rebuilt up here, hopefully before you start.
So George,
on it.
how would that happen in BGP? Just as an example, I'm gonna revert to the rib state for a moment, and instead of dealing with the config state.
Well,
that would happen.
you know that stuff.
Yeah, but I'm just
And
saying.
I know MPLS.
Okay, so how that would happen in BGP is you would do a graceful restart with your peer,
Yeah.
and you would come back up with a new table, and then you would synchronize your fib with your rib and make sure it's all okay. I would assume for the rib case, specifically for I2RS, exactly the same thing would happen. The local agent would query its controller because it had lost its brain, and therefore it would rebuild whatever it was supposed to have in its rib based on what the controller says, and therefore then the rib and the fib would resynchronize locally, just as if that was a GR over on OSPF, ISIS, or BGP. That's my assumption, Jeff. I don't know. Does anybody else have any other?
So this is an operational question.
Yes. Agreed.
And
yes. Thank
this, I'm not asking it because.
you. Yeah. I understand.
But I mean.
And again,
there
this
are other
goes to-
people beat, on CLIs.
Yes,
and,
sure.
And you're not going to cut all their fingers off
Yes.
day one.
Yep.
And so in some cases, what is in the line card is more current than what's in your store, because
Yes.
In some cases, yeah.
and so I
Yeah.
just
Correct. But yeah, that's an operational issue that we're going to have to. The easiest thing to do is to cut off all the operators' fingers and stop using CLIs. Oh, arms. Okay.
I'm just leave that one and go on. Did you have something else?
noses too.
On this note. Okay. Did you have another question too? Thank you. Dan.
Yeah, Dan Bogdanovic. So in the RIP case there, we should be careful between the dynamic protocols and putting any entries on top of it, because if you have essentially the client or writing any entries that were done by the dynamic protocol, you will get into a flip-flop situation that the dynamic protocols will, we're trying to restore the state, and you would have, the client passing down to the agent, the new state, and you will end up in a non-deterministic state.
But this is no different than having BGP and OSPF running on the same box. You have to manage that. That has to be an admin distance or something in the local.
You have to have that administrative
Right,
distance,
right,
but
right,
you have
right.
to, but that has to be very fixed.
Yes.
You have to know
Yeah.
that this is my administrative distance, and this is the way it is.
Yes.
If you don't, because you said one way I can do it this way, the other way I can do it that way.
Right.
Which way is it?
Right.
Who should I listen to?
You never
I'm-
want last route wins. That's
Yeah.
for certain.
So in the architecture document, there was a section, I think it's 7.6.1, that gave some specific examples on overwriting. If that wasn't clear, you should let us know on what we need to add for
Yeah.
requirements.
That needs to be definite.
That has to be definite, and it has to be, in line with how you really want to overlay, the data stores,
Yeah,
one
now
on
we
top
get-
of the other.
Yeah, now
Because,
we get down-
one can't be, different from the other. They have to be in sync.
Well, now we get to the
overlay,
difference.
well, let me go back and overlay between the,
Ephemeral and anything what is underneath.
Right.
I mean, like the, Interface state.
Whatever you decide to overlay the ephemeral data store on top of it. So you're saying you're overlaying the ephemeral data store onto something. You have to make sure that you have those rules fixed.
But again, we have to differentiate between the rib case and the configuration, quote unquote. I don't want to call it, but the configuration case specifically. I just use that as colloquial. In the rib case, you want an admin distance. We're assuming, I think, in the space where in the case where you create a new interface or change the IP address on an interface using a gang model through an I2RS interface, that it overrides it because it's right. But in the case of a rib, you would have admin distance, right? So it's two different cases, and that's kind of the problem I think we're running into partially.
but I,
And Jeff is running out of the room screaming.
So two things, the I2RS rib model, as you know, relies on the IETF interfaces model. We've defined in the I2RS rib model rights to the VRF, the route, the next top, but we haven't defined the interface change. Not
You also have to define and all those changes as well.
Yes.
That's all what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's why I ended it. Okay.
That's good.
Andrew Dolgan, okay. So no problems with this, but just a comment on how ephemeral goes to config. We do have in what we've done a cases when ephemeral by default that does override the config forwarding, whether it comes dynamically or statically through protocols, but we do have cases when it actually does not do that and have to coexist when you're switching from your existing mode of operation to a centralized forwarding model, and you start applying those new rules, and you don't want them to take effect, but you want to see them in the system. Are they going? So if you want to have this in service like a migration, then there may be a case that actually the config does override ephemeral. So we should consider a switch. So in one mode of operation, more common, ephemeral does override the config, but there can be a state or an application when it's a vice versa. So we should have both.
The architecture does have that in the architecture. I don't know. Anyway, the architecture has it. It has it as a local implementation flag. Dan, so I think that one's covered for the exact case where you might want to install it as ephemeral state, be able to query it as ephemeral state, which is one of the things I noted earlier was extremely important, but not actually engage it till later when you turn that switch off. So that's it. Just point, Dan, if you have a moment afterwards, I want to make sure by the way you look that I actually understood your comments. So if you would just spend some time afterwards and catch up with me. Okay, Lee.
Leah Atlas, no hats, of course. So just to emphasize, if you think for the ephemeral overriding config versus config overriding I2RS, it needs to be a switch because it depends on what your operational model is. You're talking about transitioning from a world where everyone's used to using CLI all the time and that's what they trust. You start moving to I2RS, to programmable APIs, and yet if something's going weird, you still want to have the ability to say, no, really, I need to go back to the CLI and override this to get my network stable while I figure out what's going on. And then at some point later, depending on your network, it may be the other way around. I want to trust my orchestration. I want to trust that more than the CLI fingers. That's part of why having the switch there is important. I think it really depends on the network.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. We're going to go on. I was just trying to get a notepad up. Hold on. So more questions on this ephemeral one. Okay. We're going to go to ephemeral 2. It quit? No. Not good. Let's try this. Let it go. Let me see. Yes, I got it. Okay.
I'm just here to flip the slides. You can
Yes, I'm sure you are.
ignore-
Uh-huh.
Ignore the man behind the
Um,
slide flipper.
Okay. This is talking, the next set of 3 or 4 things are talking about constraints. It is important for us to consider constraints. Constraints are the things you use to check what's happening underneath. Now, in the base configuration of netconf and restconf as interpreted by Yang 1.1, there are some very specific constraint sections. In Yang.1.1, which has just gone forward to an RFC, there are section 8.3 has constraints. Okay, so this is modifying it. Ephemeral state must be able to refer to non-ephemeral state as constraint. This is for the LSP example that ephemeral state must be able to confer to LSP ID in case we're configuring that. It must be able to configure other things. Non-ephemeral state can be configuration state, or as I just gave you the example, it can be operational state. Okay. Second one is I2RS pub sub locking, RPC, or other mechanisms. Okay, this next constraint is one about resources. That basically says, please don't kill the box for our smart implementation, which says, pub sub logging RPC can use to just come to an undesirable, unsustained resource consumption. Please we recommend you pay attention to it. Question?
John Messenger. Is this actual wording that you want wording comments on?
Yes, we'll take wording.
You say non-ephemeral state can be configuration or operational state, but that's just in the context of this paragraph.
That is correct.
I think what you mean is this non-ephemeral state. Otherwise, you're making a definition of non-ephemeral state, which you don't want to be trying to do in this paragraph.
Okay, that's a valid comment. Will the note taker please say I need to look at the English there? Thank you.
In the prioritization, are you covering also, it's not only prioritizing I2RS operations, also prioritizing I2RS controllers? When you have a situation when, for example, one controller drives your forwarding to service chains, the other drives, totally independent drives your DDoS protection. You may wanna, and forwarding to IMS type of stuff. So you need to have a priority between the controllers.
You need to have a priority between controllers and
as
make sure
well, yeah.
that's the actual rights that are occurring in Nextop we have taken care of. But please, this is complex work. You have to take a look at it when you build your implementation. But this we thought might be that one, I think, to be honest, if you've done multi-headed controllers working with the remote state, hopefully you understand what that is as you write implementation. This one, some people, I think, Dan gave us the comment last time that this could actually be something some people might not think of. Okay. This then goes to talk about another constraint. And the next constraint is the ability for a Yang module or submodel that contains data model with the property of being ephemeral and the ability to augment a Yang model with additional Yang schema nodes that have the property of being ephemeral. Now, for Yang experts, we debated the exact comment on this on the list as far as the wording. I still want to make sure that we get there. But the point is, we have to be able to have the I2RS RIB and the I2RS topology and the I2RS filtered RIB, which are ephemeral only from start to beginning. Okay, and they depend on non-ephemeral configuration, like the interface. And then we don't want to rewrite things, so we want to be able to augment it. If I want to add, for example, a BGP ephemeral addition to provide some BGP additional state. By the way, John reminds me, how many people have signed the blue sheet? Anybody not signed the blue sheet? Okay, John, when you sit back down, take it and send it to all these people. Otherwise, we get the same.
If you haven't signed the blue sheet, please quit breathing. It'll keep it much cooler in here. It's getting really hot with all you non-signers breathing.
So again, the second quality is the fact that what we're finding in Yang models for people to implement it, you really want to say augment and then include someone else's description rather than have it. So we need to have that property available for Yang. Sure, Andy.
Yang doesn't have any problem supporting that. So we're gonna kind of refine the requirements to those that actually aren't already met, or
No, and I'll be really, may I explain why? Because we want to be clear on what we want. If you say at the first phase, check, got it, that just means we've communicated well. That was the advice. Now, we tried to trim it down to things where there might be questions on either side, but this is a communication document. And so
all right.
if you say, which would make me happy, if you go through all of this, including the pub sub, and say, check, it's done, we all go home and do the Sioux dance, yay, we made it. So I'm okay with that.
All right, well, I'll feel better when there's actually a document that says, this is how you do I2RS. This is I2RS. It's not a requirement anymore. We're just stating what it is you do. And then people can say one way or another, no, I don't want to do that. Or they can say, well, I want to do it 5 different ways, and we need to support all of them. And then you could have that debate. But the requirements need to turn into a real thing.
Okay, I think this is I think that's a meta issue that perhaps we ought to take offline and discuss with Aaliyah, because that's my AD. Okay. And Andy, probably the best place for that is to talk to Aaliyah and then that net conf chairs to express that.
Well, you put out the requirements, it's like, fine, there's your requirements, nice. Doesn't mean anything's gonna happen after that.
Why don't we take that offline with Aaliyah afterwards? Because obviously I'm missing something as a chair, not as a requirements author here right now. The ephemeral configuration, and this is where we have the overlapping discussion, could override overlapping, and that's what Jeff was using earlier, local configuration or vice versa. The implementation must provide a mechanism to choose which takes precedence. This mechanism must include local configuration and may be provided via the protocol mechanisms. Now, this is what we were talking about earlier. Does this requirement have what you want? This answers. Please go ahead.
Well, Angel Eriksson, just a question. Is there one central switch that decides which takes precedence, or do you imagine that there will be a branch of a configuration that takes precedence one way, another branch the other way?
The context of this statement and the context of ephemeral configuration is in the context of an agent. So that's on a per node basis. The context of this statement. So to answer your overall question, you could design it either way, where you have but it's your operational thing. For you and for many of us, we should say one centralized controller should do it one way so you don't have conflicts. But for other people, they wanted to have more flexibility, in which case if they kill themselves, okay, they kill themselves. But that was the earlier will of the working group, that we provide flexibility for people who think they can do something different.
So the different switches could be for different controllers or for different parts of the configuration?
The I2RS agent goes with a forwarding thing, something you put a ribbon. the client, which is what I think you mean by the controller,
Yeah.
you can have multiple clients. They can conflict with one another, which is what we'll describe right now. We consider it an error, but we have ways to handle it. And one client may be have more priority than another client. For example, if you have a configuration client, one of the examples you're citing, you probably want to have that configuration client take precedence over the guy that's just monitoring. Or you may have, so I may want to say, if I say change it via my configuration client, change it, my monitoring client doesn't get to do that. It only gets to read it. And so that's another one. You may have your normal configuration client as a second example, and you'll have a denial of service client that says, oh, but I know this is a normal configuration right over. Those two examples are just examples we normally work with right now in RIB and CLI configurations. Okay. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Questions, comments on this? Hi, Joe.
Joe Clark, Cisco. Is this what Aaliyah was talking about? Aaliyah, when you said the switch? Okay.
Yes.
It seems to me, and I could be wrong or whatever, debatable, that if we use priority, we could say and make this kind of a more standardized approach rather than what this is very kind of flexible, like any implementer could do anything they want as long as they meet this. But if CLI, if local configuration had a priority that could play with this, I could say, okay, temporarily the priority of local CLI is higher. I'm talking I2RS priority here. Okay, I've done my debugging. Now I'm going to set priority back to default so my my ephemeral state takes precedence, and make it very explicit how this is to be implemented so that all implementations of I2RS kind of play together.
That would also bring it in line possibly with the RIB work too, wouldn't it, Sue? I don't know. 'Cause
Pardon?
That would bring it in line
What's
with
that?
the RIB work as well, wouldn't it?
Yes. But
Okay.
do you want to have the same thing for, how do you then, that's a really good point. And earlier people had said they wanted to widen it rather than restrict it. The
Mhm.
architecture document goes specifically to local configuration versus the other. The question is, and that's something you might want to talk to Alex and Eric about, is what happens in the topology case? Is this same comment germane in that case? So I'm looking for input. Should we go to that particular restriction or not? But we want to take a look at all the types of models that we're currently doing.
Sure. Okay. One of it was clarifying what it is in my head, and the second is you bring up a good point, but I wanted to raise that it seems like if every implementation did something differently, it might become very difficult to use I2RS to decide what overrides what. But
Okay, it's a good comment.
Okay.
If you'd actually send that to the list as well, that'll
Sure.
keep us commenting on it. Jeff, did I miss anything? You worked with this?
Specifically
Okay.
with the question of what that does to topologies.
Yes, and
Right.
and
That
Joe,
would be
that's the piece we really, why we kept this more wide piece. Look at the topology, what happens if you had a prioritization, because topology is picking it up from OSPF and ISIS as a read up. And so think through that, make sure that works. That's why I left it that way. Please go
Yeah, the
ahead.
prioritization would work. I would agree that there's no point of doing yet additional mechanisms or switch or something. So people can read this and start creating extra things. If you have just prioritization, it will just probably do the trick for everything we need. Yeah.
Okay, so your feedback is this will give people enough implementation room. Go ahead, Jeff.
So there are cases like topology where you probably wouldn't be interacting with configuration states strictly through a edit config style of maintaining the state. Because if you can, we do run into these problems where you could end up with inconsistent topology. In those sorts of cases, it's more likely that the configuration that's coming into the system, even if it's ephemeral, may be coming through RPC, which allows it to be consistently applied.
Yes, and please note that the RIB has not only a read-write value in the I2RS RIB, but has RPCs that provide consistency when changing next hop or routes within a whole bunch of data, so you don't lose things. Please note that that's actually been thought about and put into many of these models. Topology authors, Alex, any comments you want to make on this? Please, thoughts? No is fine, because I don't know what to say next. Okay, that's unusual. Okay, Yang focus. In addition to being able to say true false about a configuration, there must be a way to indicate Yang schema modes represent ephemeral state. Okay, it must be desirable to allow and have a way to indicate config false schema nodes which are writable operational state. Did I get this, Jürgen, in its final form, or did I think this is the form that came for you. If I've missed something, please let me know. I tried to keep your form. Questions about this? Okay, we will go on. 9 and 10. Andy, you will see the comment you had earlier. I believe that many of this may be existent in NetConf, but we wanted to state it. Support for communication mechanisms to enable an I2RS client to determine that the I2RS agent supports the mechanisms needed for operations. Okay, you may have in all the stuff that settled, and it must support notifications of write conflicts using the priority requirements defined in section 7 below, which is the other ones. I'm not sure that's there, but some people have said maybe that was. Again, we should have that discussion about how we exhibit it. This goes into multi-headed control, and I spelled multi-headed control wrong this morning. Okay. Questions on the last one? Okay, multi-headed control is about two clients interacting to change the state and how we handle it. The architecture says that it's an error that eventually the operation should be able to understand and not really have it, that the controllers are in charge of their lives and they should be able to peacefully work at it. However, that said, we want to have clear deterministic rules. Deterministic rules say that the I2RS may store an I2RS client identity and not the affected priority at the time the data model. That is, and again, in implementing it became fairly simple. Hi, you're setting up a place where you might just simply, when you have a client ID, priority, and opaque, which are the threesome we have, saved to indicate who's changing, you could just put that in a table and put a pointer. Easy. You can also indicate which is the connection. That's another thing. You may also want to say what transaction is occurring. Is this an RPC with a write? Is it an RPC with a query? Okay. This is much like if you've ever done rib table work inside of a router. There's a lot of these things that sort of happen in most implementations. Go ahead, Eric. Andy, I do have another reason that stuff is being responded, but I should probably also tell you that offline.
Yeah, Eric Voigt again. This gets back to my comment on number 1, and the comment in requirement 1, it said that any restoral of state would be coming from the client or the agent itself, which is fine. But I don't know how anybody would know if it's a restoral or not in this architecture. I think it's any changes would still come through those agents. Is there a reason in 1 why a restoral is being brought out as being different than any other type of state update? Do you see where I'm going with that?
Oh, okay, Joel has an answer.
All right.
Yeah,
Joel Halpern, the reason for writing requirement 1 is not because there's a behavioral difference. Indeed, everything comes from the client to the agent. The reason for 1 is that we as human beings tend to think about restoral as somehow different and important. And so in laying out the requirement, we're saying restoral behaves just like everything else. It comes from the client. It could, if you think that wording would help, we could say it there. But That's the point. It's not because there is some difference in behavior. There isn't. Restoral is just like everything else.
Okay, I have a chair moment. We are going through the requirements. To our other new work authors, we're going to give you a deep apology because I think we're going to run out of time. I will, if you wish, schedule a interim to cover your topic, Pedro. And so I apologize, but the working group really has to work through these requirements. Okay, I think I've gone through that. I think I've said when there's a collision that occurs, two clients are trying to write the same data node, it's considered an error, and you have priorities to determine it. I've noted that netconf and restconf hosts can come concurrently from alternate sources. And the 13th one is that it's required to handle it. And again, Eric, I don't think there's any difference. And 14, a determinist conflicting must be able to handle the error scenario. So these words, again, we went through 4 different words because people kept saying, that one doesn't really say it. If you think we should boil it down, I haven't heard it on the list. So to the netconf and netmod folks, these last 4 maybe seem overly wordy. Feedback is useful. Okay, section 7.9 of the I2RS architecture it states that the architecture does not include multi-message itemicity or rollback mechanisms. Okay, no multi-message, but you may have multiple messages because you read a thing and write another whole different section of a data model. I write into the RIB model, but I'm reading out of the topology model.
Hi, Dan Bogdanovic. A comment without the multi-headed control and the multiple transactions, especially on the rollback. This, you should have a mechanism that if you have an error condition, how to do a rollback. And this is the same thing here when you're doing multiple transactions, how you will do a rollback to previous state. Because you can get here a multiple state transaction,
Right.
multiple transaction request to change the state from a one guy and then it doesn't go forward.
Mhm.
And then you might have, from multiple ones and then you have to restore it as well.
That's right. And if you've done any significant, as I was coding the RIB, even in the Quagga implementation, I was taking care of those particular pieces. And you have to have done some, if you're doing these configurations, you have to understand those facts.
These two should be, correlated.
Yes.
We cannot view them or have two separate ways how to handle both of them, at least in my opinion.
Yes, but I hope the requirements being separate still means you have to look at all of them together. If I've missed something about that, then I'll ask more. Okay, and there are 3 pub sub requirements. Again, just to be clear, the pub sub must support subscriptions that are ephemeral. It must support filtering that are ephemeral, and the subscription support must ephemeral. So I added the last one because Alex felt it was helpful to make sure everything was clear. Now, I think we're down to 5 minutes. Are we done at 2:30, 3:30?
I
Right?
think that's right, yes.
Okay, so time for the hum. And you get to do the hum stuff.
So let's take a hum. Does everybody like what's here?
Did you want a question before the hum? Oh, that was the general hum.
Go ahead.
And who doesn't like what's here and thinks it needs to change radically or in a major way?
Okay, Kent Watson. I was going to ask a question on the previous slide, but I could answer your question. Some of the requirements have the words like may and should, which I find confusing from a requirements perspective. I would like to see them all either be must or must not.
That was not the will of the working group, and in the routing area, we have may, should, and must, so that's not unfamiliar to the routing. Could you explain why you want must. We felt that these were
Well, like on
instruct-
slide 20, I think it is, where you have the maze. Yes.
the priority may be dynamically changed by IEEE.
So is, who decides the may? Is this?
So like
the
it's
implementer?
reality grasp, implementation grasp. If you have a client ID, you're Kent, and you have priority 5 and you have something here, your priority could be changed by AAA.
Hi, Lou Berger. I suspect what you're trying to say here is that the solution must support the ability to
Correct.
select.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
That's fine. You
That's
can
correct.
send that
That's
change to us.
different than may, because the solution may means it may or may not. If it doesn't, it's okay. I mean, if that's what you mean, great. If it's that, it's
That's fine.
required that it has the option, then you should have the words. Yep. That's right. As soon as you
Okay.
say may, it means the requirement we can ignore.
That's fine. And if that's what you really mean by all the may going to musts, we'll work on that. Thank you.
Just keep in mind, as in any spec, if the word may is there, anyone is free to ignore it.
Or should. Thank you.
In IEEE 802, we always remind people that may is equivalent to may not.
Okay. So we will review that. To my presenters, we will schedule an interim. Pedro, I will schedule it at your complex. Again, I apologize. The work that Pedro is doing is actually is about conflict resolution, which is what we just went through. I'm afraid we would not be even able to get a hold of you. How many people would, no, we're not going to have enough time because we'll run into another working group. So Pedro, and who is presenting the group data? Were you? Okay. So we're going to schedule an interim and specifically deal with those topics because they're really interesting new work. One's on the data center fabric and how these data models might be ephemeral. And the second is on conflict resolution, which is, I think, one of the most interesting pieces because Pedro's group has, he's got some really thoughts because they're working on implementation and how this might work out. With that said, with those who have made comments on the list, that please send them to the mail list so we can do that. And thank you for joining us.
So we'll just have to go through what's called yeah. And Joe needs to send his comments. Because those are good. Discuss.